the SCA now. I stand in the back with my crossbow and shoot people in the face.
Well, welcome to the 1632 Minicon. I'm Walt Boyes. I'm the editor of the Gazette. And the first thing we're going to do is our traditional Weird Tech panel for the next few hours. Rick Boatright and Kevin Evans and I will be talking about the different paths that technology has taken in the 1632 universe. Some real weird paths.
Right.
Rick?
Here. Thank you. So, I'm turning this session around from my traditional order because I always run out of time to do something that I want to do at the end. So I'm going to do the end first. So, there is a reality that all of us that are involved with technology face and always have, that Murphy's Law plagues us. And there's no way to avoid it. It's simply part of the way the universe is built. Another science fiction author, Christopher Stasheff, in his Wizard series, the Grammy series, had an absolutely wonderful way of describing it. He said that Murphy's imps of the perverse express the perversity of the universe. And boy, is that true. And so, one of the characters in the 1632 series had read Chris's books and was enamored of them and wanted to, and loved the idea of a talisman that the technologists would use against Murphy's imps to help them be reminded to keep Murphy in front of them. You can say, "Get thee behind me, Satan," but Murphy you've got to keep in front of you. You've got to keep your eye on it. And so the talisman that he chose was the exact same as Chris Stasheff's talisman, the little yellow pocket screwdriver, which reminds you of that. Now, Chris, in his stories, had this be the symbol of the order of the church devoted to Saint Vinicon of the Cathode, one of his characters. Father Nick thought that would be a good idea, but Larry Mazzari in the 1632 series said no, that he was not going to allow him to start an order, a Catholic order, devoted to a fictional saint created by an unchurched Episcopalian. So, and not only that, but it was the wrong saint anyway, because the right saint had been sainted in 1596 and was, in fact, and still is, the patron saint of joy, the patron saint of buffoonery, and the patron saint of fools. This seems entirely appropriate for those of us involved in technology. Not only that, but his name is Saint Philip. So it's entirely appropriate to have as our talisman against Murphy, Saint Philip's screwdriver. Okay, fine. Normally I do a joke, but don't laugh. But normally I have a bigger audience. So anyway, so I have for you today, as your souvenir from visiting 1632, visiting the Empire. If you don't already have one, you have your very own St. Philip screwdriver. So there you go. And would you just pass those along if you wouldn't mind terribly? Thank you. And do me a favor, only take one. I do have to buy them. So that would be the first. And then the second thing that we have, of course, is the badge ribbons, which say, cleverly, Holy St. Philip protect us. So that's the handouts. And every year, I kept running out of time to hand this out. So, yes, sir.
I get it.
St. Philip, are we talking Philip King or are we
Philip Neri.
Philip Neri, thank you.
St. Philip Neri, sainted in 1596. Patron saint of fools and buffoonery and practical jokes. So, now Philip was the perfect person for a saint devoted to technology. He was, one time he addressed the College of Cardinals wearing half a beard. He was frequently given over to people that came to him for confession. He was given over to giving them penances like, well, I want you to go around in Rome for the next 2 days with your clothes on inside out. Or he would hand them a collection of comic poetry and tell them to dance down the street while reciting it. You know, things like that, because he said famously that it's much easier to bring a joyous soul to God. Duh! Sadly, most of the depictions of St. Philip are classic saint paintings with him going, you know, with his serious face and staring up at them. This is not an accurate picture of the man.
He must have been dead when they painted.
Yeah, well, you know, anyway. The only really good picture of St. Philip that I know is the one on top drawn by a teacher at the St. Philip Neri School here in the States, and it depicts him with half a beard, which I think is great. Well, there is St. Philip with the Pomeranian. I'll take that because we have a Pomeranian. So, but the bottom one there, so anyway, but a joyful heart is more easily made perfect than a downcast one. And let us aim for joy rather than respectability, make fools of ourselves from time to time, and thus see ourselves for a moment as God sees us. And so our talisman, and so you should have those. And so I, once again, run ahead of the PowerPoint, big deal. So what is weird tech? Because that's the title of this session. Well, it's none of these things. It's not steampunk goggles. It's not wristwatches with gears and springs that do absolutely nothing. It's famously not dirigibles where the gas bag is maybe 1/50th the size of the gas bag needed to lift that thing. It's not aircraft, steampunk aircraft that the wings would fold up the first time. And I have no idea how those things fly. So I don't even know what they think makes them fly. So, you know, that doesn't work, does it? Well, you know, in the 1632 universe, we have a rule. We say until May of 1631, when Granville landed in Germany, this is precisely, history went the way it went. The world was what the world was. And then the other thing we did was, with a few exceptions that we needed for plot, we took a real town, Mannington, West Virginia, an aged, somewhat impoverished mining town, and scooped up that 6-mile circle and sent it to 1631. And so, why the series is called 1632 is an interesting question, which we won't address right now. So in any event, we dropped them into May of 1631. We scooped them up in April of 2000. And the rule, with a couple of noted exceptions, is if it wasn't in Mannington, West Virginia, in April of 2000, it's not in this series. So that, once again, gives us an anchor for everything we do. And it keeps us grounded. So Mannington didn't have the Walmart, it didn't have a Radio Shack, it didn't have lots of things, because it's a small, somewhat impoverished mining town.
It had some cell phones.
Some cell phone towers and some cell phones, one cell phone tower, but that's another question for another day. So what is weird tech then? Well, weird tech has to work, okay? It can be something that's been forgotten in our world. It can be something that's been bypassed, that was never mainstream because something else had already been propagated. It can be something that is mainstream, but most people don't know about it, and it's not something that everybody knows. That can still be weird, but it has to work. Big print, bold, big, bold print. It has to work. So the only steampunk dirigible I've ever found in any illustration anywhere in many Google searches is this steampunk dirigible, because it has wheels. Because steampunk dirigibles can't fly. So anyway, every now and then we'll do one of these, and we'll get people with top hats and goggles and things come in, and I will make fun of them. So, and I warn them about that at the front. So, past weird tech topics. This year, we're going to come back and revisit some of these later, but I've got some new stuff that I want to talk to you about. And so, we'll revisit these later, but just up front, one of my favorite weird tech topics, and one of Gorg's favorites, Gorg Huff here at the front, is the air cushion landing aircraft.
Yeah,
Okay?
slidey.
Originally developed by Goodyear, developed further by Boeing, extensively tested by the Canadian military. They really wanted this to be a good idea. Really, really. So they put air cushion landing vehicles on BOAC cargo vehicles, short takeoff and landing cargo vehicles, because they really, Canada's got a lot of spaces where there's just nothing there. Lots of it is flat, and so an air cushion landing vehicle sounded like a cool idea. And they tried and tried and tried, but there's a couple of problems. The biggest single would be it's a frictionless surface. And so you can't brake, you can't steer, and it won't go uphill. And if you've got a downhill on the landing that you're doing, you just keep sliding. It's just not good. They tried and tried. They tried so long that one of the big, and I've got another picture somewhere, one of the big model airplane kit companies actually made a kit of that. And it was on sale for like a year and a half. And I've never found one, but I would love to find one if somebody does. So anyway, that's one of our past subjects. One of my pet subjects, one of my pet weird techs, is the Ewing system, monorail railroad system. Invented by an Englishman, Ewing, clever enough, huh? And built once in the entire world, once. It's the Patiala State monorail tramway in India, running through some of the tea gardens, carrying burdens up to and down from the tea gardens. The Ewing system is extremely cool. This is one of those kinds of things, because in places like India and other places where you don't have a highly developed infrastructure, you lay a single track, one iron rail. And then you build your cars so that 95% of the weight is borne by that one iron rail. And 5% of the weight is borne by a wheel that sets on the road that the rail runs beside. So if you have a road, you don't have to clear an entire right-of-way. You don't have to clear an entire roadbed. You don't have to lay ties. You put one rail along the side of your road. It doesn't take up your road. It doesn't keep the wagons from going. It runs along beside the road on a wheel that carries 5% of the weight.
Actually, they have to lay ties, but they're only this long.
Yeah, the ties are this long, yeah. And so it's cheap. And so you can see here an experiment that they did with the single rail and the wheels and a small automobile engine as the motive power. The tramway also experimented with ox power, bullock power. You can see the longhorn water buffalo bullocks.
Primarily ox power.
Yeah, and then it was primarily ox power. They did build 2 steam engines. A company in Germany built them for them. You can see here the PSMT, the Patiala State Monorail Tramway. And the steam engine is centered over that monorail with, again, about 5% of the weight carried by the outrigger wheel. There is still one copy of this running at the Indian State Railway Museum outside Dallas. And you can go and pay your ticket and go for a ride on the last existing Ewing system railroad in the world. There is, if you Google for it, there's a guy who is as enamored of this as I am, but a lot even crazier than me, who has built an HO scale model train system of Ewing system engines and cars and switches and the whole bit. Think about it, switches are so much easier. There's one rail.
They're all
just switch it.
switches.
You know? and it's cheap. And here's the other thing: because the cars balance, because the cars, not the engine, but the cars, most of the cars balance on a single wheel that's rolling on the track, and then they keep from tipping forward and back by the cars ahead and behind them, right? And so, as a result, this thing can take curves that are very, very tight, where a regular steam engine, you know, the flanges would be rubbing against the rail and be going, yeah, and you'd wear out the rail in just no time at all. So it worked great in the T-curtains because it could handle the switchbacks.
Well, Ewing originally designed it to be an industrial locomotive system, so the track could be relocated easily, and if you had a plant, you needed to carry heavy things from here to there, and then next week over here, you could just move the rail.
Yeah. So, and in Ewing's test systems that he built in England, the rail was bolted to the ties, and so you could just pick up a section of rail and move it.
Like a model railroad.
Yeah, exactly, like a model railroad. And so very cool stuff. Why then was only one ever built? It's a really good question, isn't it?
Yes.
Because Ewing didn't publish it until after 1900. Trains had been around for a rather long time by then.
Like 70 years?
Or more, yeah. So trains had been around for a long time. The train builders and the track builders and the people that made steam engines and all of that, they had refined all of that. There were international standards about all of that. Nobody was going to mess around with some weirdo thing from England at a time when they already had perfect, you could buy small scale, you know, narrow gauge, track and engines and parts, and you could buy standard gauge and even wide gauge in England and Russia.
Really?
But it was all standardized. You know? And so why would anybody mess with it? The answer was no one would. There was an enthusiast in India who thought, this is so cool! And so he built one. And it ran for about 50 years, more or less, and then they abandoned it. And they recovered the engine and parts from some falling down sheds and recovered them and restored them and put them back in service at the Indian State Railway Museum outside Delhi. Very cool stuff.
A locomotive manufacturer was Henschel's,
So,
and he built both three of those.
Yeah, so in the 1632 universe, in the Rain Fire, we went, cool, half the price of iron, right? Iron is an extremely low availability product in the 17th century. The total output of Europe in terms of iron and steel, the total output of Europe would not allow for us to lay a standard gauge track between Grantville and Magdeburg in 1632. We had to scale up iron production in Europe by a lot to deal with the amount of iron we needed. And so it's not that hard. No, you just have to.
You have to do it.
You have to know.
And
So-
in order to do it, you've got to have transportation.
Right away.
Well, there's all those things. So in the 1632 universe, many of our authors have used the Ewing system because, duh. And by the way, you can do Ewing system rails with wooden rail at first. As a matter of fact, Ewing system rails laid with half-round split tree trunk wooden rails and automobile rims with no tire to fit over the split rail work extremely well for quote a long time, close quote, okay, meaning years, not decades, right? But so, and wood is also hard to come by in Germany in the 17th century. There's a saying in Germany that every tree has a name tag.
Still does.
Still
I've
does.
seen
Yeah.
that.
So they had been managing forests for centuries. But nevertheless, it's easier to come up with wooden rail than iron is cheaper, and it works just fine. So a lot of our authors have used Ewing system stuff, which I think is just extremely cool and clearly fits under this broad definition of weird tech, right? No problem. Now, what are we going to talk about today then? because that's from the past. And I went ahead and spent 10 minutes on it because I love it. And we'll come back to some other things. But we're going to talk about some other things first. And the first one today is the idea of the mechanical reproduction of music. Okay? And you may have seen up here we have a crank turntable. How many of you have actually used one? Right. So you've seen them in movies, you may have seen them on television, but very few people have actually used one anymore. I spent a long time with searches saved on eBay looking for one that I could afford that was portable. I couldn't bring one with the big flower horns because how would I ship it? You know? The other problem with the big flower horns is those frickers are expensive. They sell for $700 and $800. This is not exactly a hobby. I've been doing it since 2001, but it's not how I make my living. And while I get royalties, those don't pay for $700 Victrolas. So I've been looking for a portable, cheap record player. Found one this year. Someone had managed to put a listing on eBay where they misspelled both gramophone and Victrola. And so I was the only bidder. So anyway, so we're going to try that. But y'all know how this works? You know anything about how it works? Well, you can imagine there's a crank. There's a clockwork style crank, spring-powered motor underneath that spins the turntable. All of that's pretty straightforward, right? Then, here on the tone arm, there is what they call, cleverly, a reproducer. Inside of here, there is a diaphragm stretched across this circle. So there's a diaphragm that stretches across the circle. You can open this up, but I'm not going to. There's this diaphragm that stretches across the circle, and then there's a metal lever that goes up from here. This is on a hinge and moves back and forth. This little lever that sets here is on a hinge, moves back and forth. And so as it moves back and forth, it flexes that diaphragm. And so it makes sound. Can you hear it? Mm-hmm. But you don't hear much, do you? Mm-hmm. Okay? You don't hear much because there's a little diaphragm in there. It can be metal, it can be paper, it can be a lot of things. But there's this little tiny diaphragm in there, and then there's this screw thread here, and you can stick a needle in. Interestingly enough, on mechanical record players, needles are intended to be used once. They were disposable from the day the system was invented. As a matter of fact, records, the early pressings of records, the lacquer that they pressed the record out of had a silica sand, finely ground sand embedded in it that would wear away the needle rather than having the needle wear away the record. Okay? And as the needle wears and gets duller and duller, it starts wearing off the record, and so you start seeing black dust accumulate, and that's the music. So the needles were always disposable, although there were people who sold things that were needle sharpeners that had cranks, and you would screw the needle into it, and it had a little extremely fine-toothed file, and you would crank it and lower it, and it would sharpen the needle through, which was really ridiculous because the needles back then were 100 for 10 cents or something, you know. So anyway, but the needles are disposable, and there's a guy now here in the U.S. who sells packs of 100 needles for $5. And so, you know, and if you ever see somebody, there are a couple of people who sell diamond and sapphire needles for mechanical record players. They're a really bad idea because they're hard, where these are intentionally soft steel. And so the diamond and sapphire needles do not wear off, and the record does. And you get this dust, and that's your music. So then what happens is, you can't really hear this. It doesn't make much noise. So what happens is, there's this big hollow tube, see that? And it's this big hollow tube, and it feeds into a horn that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. just like those flower horns that you've seen, this one, the horn is entirely contained inside the player. The sound comes out in the back and reflects off the lid. But the idea is, for those of you who are into electronics, it's an impedance match transformer. We're matching the impedance, the acoustic impedance of the reproducer with the acoustic impedance of the air in the room. And so by taking the very small waves coming out of the reproducer and then letting them grow out through a hyperbolically expanding horn, we get the bass reproduced and it couples better with the air in the room. So that's how the system works. Now, those of you who have or had turntables, regular electrical LP turntables, you might know the tracking force, the pressure that an LP turntable with a diamond stylus puts on a record depends on the quality of your turntable, but it's 1 to 7 grams. A gram is the weight of a dime. And so modern electrical turntables have a tracking force of 1 to 7 grams. This thing weighs a whole lot more than 7 grams. The tracking force on this needle is 130 grams because it's got to hold the needle down and the needle gets shaken by the record as it goes and plays. Does that make sense? Cool. So we're going to try it, okay? So I'll stick the reproducer back on the horn here, and we'll crank her up. Normally the job of the young child is tasked to stand in front of the record player and make sure that it stays cranked up. You know.
Yeah, you should have brought one of the good here.
Yeah, I know. So, I have a couple of records. I don't know which one plays better. We're going to try this one first. Grant me this is surprisingly loud.
Yeah.
Okay? Considering that it's fully mechanical, it's surprisingly loud. I kind of blown away.
Rick, watch your move.
So,
Think you hooked the
oops,
mic.
sorry. So that's okay, but the sound quality, that by the way was Benny Goodman and the clarinet section from his band playing right, Bach Goes to Town. Benny Goodman's arrangement of a Bach chorale. And so you heard what the mechanical version does, right? Here's another version, or here's another reproduction of the exact same piece. Hold on. Turn off my Bluetooth so I'm not talking to my headset. Thank you so much. And then come in here and bring up my work piece. Yeah. I should have had this staged and ready. I'm so sorry.
While he's doing that, I'm going to mention that in the early days of sound reproduction, the primary issue was in recording the sound, not in playback. The problems that they had, the things that kept the sound quality low in the teens and the 20s, wasn't the playback devices, it was the recording devices. When the 1632 universe happens, They bring back a bunch of electromagnetic recording devices in the forms of tape recorders and this sort of thing that take care of that end of the problem, so they can produce a much better record to play on this sort of mechanical recording device.
Right.
And this is really common throughout the entire 1632 universe as far as technology is concerned. An awful lot of the technology that gets used in the 1632 universe is really make do. We know how to do it right, we just can't. So we have to figure out how to do it so that it works.
Yeah, half-assed.
Or three-quarter ass,
Exactly.
but generally speaking, that's the way it is. So what we usually wind up doing is having a kind of a mismatch between the kind of technology we want to have and the kind of technology we can actually produce. Sometimes it works, sometimes it works okay. It's like the dancing bear.
Very true.
You don't say that the dancing bear dances really well. It's the fact that the dancing bear dances at all.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Don't know. Maybe you did a real good job. But anyway. Yes, that's fine. Connect things good. Now, where's my? Okay, now.
The other interesting thing is at the time, lots of stuff was already there. Wimhurst has already invented his device, his Wimhurst generator. Electronic concepts and mathematics is already being developed before they get there.
So, I apologize for the delay. Sometimes these things happen. So we'll grab something out of here, and I'll have just a few seconds of it. Come on, give me a few seconds. Thanks. So this is what the same recording in an electronic format.
Back in the digital format.
In a digital format. Yeah. Okay. So you're gonna really let's go. Get easy. Maybe. Or not. Connected? Maybe we should have internet. Oh well, so much for that. Anyway, so the point is, it's a really crummy reproduction system because it's mechanical, because there's no good way to reproduce bass. You get a pretty good response on the higher frequencies, audio frequencies, but bass just sucks because it just does. And so as a result, the only thing we can do is accept that reality, because non-mechanical, electronic, anything in the early years of 1632, just not going to happen. Jack Carroll sitting over there is our house expert, has become self-educated house expert on tube technology. First, trust me, transistors, not happening anytime soon. Tubes, give them the number, Jack.
Well, the first functional laboratory test model of the tubes happened on October 13, 1634 in a lab vacuum chamber. I projected that the first fully sealed tube that could be carried away from the lab would probably be about mid-November, and pilot production starts to tool up early 1635.
So we start having, quote, production, close quote, of tubes in 1635. That's not tens of thousands of tubes, folks. That's handmade tubes with handmade grids and handmade filaments, and you can throw more people at it, but it's still, the production is hundreds.
Yeah, the other bottleneck is the design of tubes, because Gridville came through with 0 electronics engineers. They had to train one. She was a 19-year-old German record. And she spent her first year on the job studying what she needed to do for that day's work. So they need to design 4 tube types to make a complete communication receiver. And I project that happening right August of 1635.
So, but the very first tubes, which are simple triodes, 3-element tubes, are useful for things like amplifiers. You can use them for relatively crude radio receivers, that sort of thing. They work, but they're not, how can I say this? They're not
high performance.
They're not high performance, and they're frequency limited.
They're not high fidelity.
They're not high quality.
Well,
But one of there's two things here that this all boils down to. The first is that the only people who think this is not amazing, wonderful, and near miraculous are the uptimers, because they actually know what it should sound like. The downtimers think this is freaking amazing, and they all want one. And the other thing that what Jack was talking about is that it takes way longer than you think it should to do anything with tech. There's going to be a panel either tomorrow or Sunday about about how long it takes to develop things in the 1632 universe. We have a problem, Bjorn and I, as editors of the Gazette, explaining to people, no, you can't do that yet, because it doesn't make sense. And the comment we always get back is, you're just trying to restrict my story. No, we're actually trying to make it semi-believable. So, can you make it any louder?
well, not off my phone, but
Okay.
here's what I can do.
You have an amplifier right there.
Well, no, but I have a coupling device, because the phone speaker is little teeny tiny, right? And it doesn't couple very well with the air in the room. It's a little teeny tiny speaker. And so, just like the record player here, it had trouble getting bass out of that little teeny tiny speaker, because normal speakers are big, so they can make big low frequency waves, right?
Like that one right above you.
Yeah, like that one above me. So, and by the way, the other thing I can and will do is turn a microphone on and hold it up to it. But first, let's cheat, okay? Better. Why? Because it couples, right? Same reason. Okay? Now, actually, I can actually cheat with a speaker like this by the simple expedient of doing this. Kind of amazing, huh?
You've done a waveguide.
Right? So, anyway, but just so you know what it does sound like, well, nah, that's okay. So you see the idea. So the hyperbolic horn, expanding horn, provides an impedance match. Yes, yes, stop. Thank you. It's so kind of you to keep doing this. Really, you can stop now. Thank you. So that's mechanical reproduction of music. There's an article in the Gazette that I wrote with an English fan, Chris Pinnecate. We spent over a year going back and forth and working through the details of recording by lacquer discs and reproducing them in 1632 using magnets, batteries, other simple non-electronic recording technology, or amplification, and we settled on a system that would actually work, and so in the same issue that we published that, then Gorgon Paula had an absolutely wonderful story called Trommler Records about the economic and cultural effects of producing mechanical reproduction of sound. By the way, you might remember that the first recordings were not shaped like this, right? You've all seen pictures of Edison's cylinders, right? And Edison made those cylinders and they sold pre-recorded music on cylinders for years, but there were two problems. One is that cylinders are very difficult to mass produce because you've got all that fine detail along the groove, along the spiral groove along the cylinder. How do you cast that or copy it or whatever? The answer is you don't. And so what Edison and his recording companies did was they had gangs of record cutting machines, and they would slide a cylinder onto each of them and play the master and cut the recording and sell those. And so every one was a freshly recorded cylinder until Berliner came up with the idea of unwinding the cylinder, pressing it flat, and making flat records, and then you could reproduce them by making a mold and just going slum. And that worked out very well. So we still do it. Yeah. So anyway, there you go. So that's that. And so anyway, going back to what we were talking about before, slideshow. So that's the idea of mechanical reproduction of music. While I'm babbling, any questions before I move on? I was a high school teacher, it still shows. So topic 2, cheap, simple printing tech. At this point, I'm going to diverge for a moment because I want to talk about something else that leads into cheap, simple printing tech, okay? Every primitive culture around the world, primitives in the mountains in New Guinea, cultures from Southeast Asia to the Amazon to everywhere, have looms. Any group of people that came up with a way to have a fiber and to make string developed two things that they did with the string. They made fishing nets. So they developed a way to tie knots in string and make nets. And that technology seems pretty much universal. Everybody uses the same kind of knots and the same kind of way of doing it to use string to make nets. And so we'll just call that netting and call it a thing. And there are examples of netting in the absolutely earliest fiber samples that we have found in any archaeological digs anywhere in the world, in almost every culture. And there are also woven materials made from whatever the local culture made string out of, or thread, and they built looms and they wove. Some of those cultures made looms that were only an inch or two wide, and they made belts and sashes and stuff. Some of them, the Egyptians and the Chinese and others, made looms that were quite wide and made truly gorgeous fabrics, right? 3000 BC, we have examples from Egyptian tombs of fine woven linen that's as good as anything you can buy today. Just amazing stuff, and the Egyptians wove that kind of thing. So weaving is a pervasive technology. Every culture makes looms. Some of the looms are extremely primitive, sticks and shuttle. Some are very primitive, some are incredibly elaborate, but everybody weaves fabric. That's what they do with thread, cord, yarn, whatever. Nets and weaving. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the room. what is the oldest archaeological example, the oldest copy that we can find anywhere, in any dig, in any culture, anywhere in the world, of something that's knit? Knitting.
I think it's medieval. I think it's in that.
That's a little earlier than that. It's about 1000 AD.
Yeah, late iron.
Think about this for a minute. By that time, people had been using looms for thousands of years all over the world, right? Nobody took two needles and started carrying loops along the needle and doing knitting. There are no examples, none, anywhere in the world predating 1000 or so. The actual earliest example is a pair of socks found in a tomb in Egypt, dating to somewhere between 1050 and 1100, but they're pretty elaborate. They have a pattern knitted into them, so the presumption is that people in Egypt had been knitting for some time by then, which it makes sense, right? But you know, if you thought about it, you'd think knitting's got to be ancient. There have to be examples of knitting. We're just overlooking things. And the answer for textile historians the world over, although it drives them utterly insane, and many of them will say over and over again, you will see in their articles, if you look at the books or the articles on the history of textiles, you will see them say, although knitting must be an ancient primitive technology, there are no examples prior to. Okay, does that make sense?
And crocheting is even.
Well, you're jumping ahead. You let me give my talk. Shh. So, yeah.
How did they make clothing? They weren't naked until 1000.
What did I talk about? Weaving?
They moved.
Weaving and netting. But
And
not
felting.
knitting. No knits.
They did felting too.
Well, felting too, but that's not thread, so. Well,
No, but
okay,
it's
you
still
can.
felting.
Just let me give my talk. So that gets us up to about somewhere around 1000 AD, right? Now, you've all seen people crochet. Okay, one hook, not two needles like knitting. One stick with a hook on the end. And you stick it through a loop, you
Like
pull a
this.
little loop like that. She is crocheting back there. You stick it through, you pull out a little loop, then you stick it through that loop and pull out a little loop, and stick it through that loop and pull out a little loop, right? This is the simplest way to make fabric in the world, okay? I mean, truly, if you have a source of thread or yarn, nothing is simpler than crocheting plain fabric. She's doing something fancy-ass, but really, just to make flat crochet material, it's nothing. The earliest example of any crochet material ever found by the fabric textile history people, and the earliest printed examples of instructions for how to crochet, and the earliest crochet hooks we've ever found in any archaeological dig. Anybody want to make a guess? You don't talk. Don't speak. Yeah.
Ancient Egypt, I believe.
Nice guess, but sadly wrong. 1840.
It's not late.
Yes.
1840 for crochet. Nothing older than
And it was
that,
iron?
ever, anywhere.
Well, they used to use button hooks though for the.
But not for, but
Not for
seriously,
thread.
the make a loop, make a loop, make a loop, no examples anywhere prior to 1840. Isn't that nuts?
Yeah.
Okay,
They
now,
may have been doing it for 20 or 30 years.
or maybe even, let's go as early as 1800, okay?
Right.
But there are nothing, there are no examples, there's nothing.
Nothing.
Now we find archaeological things in the Danish bog burials and in Kurgan burials in Siberia, where the bodies were frozen and stuff. And we find things which, when you look at them, you think they're either knit or crocheted, until some sad, overworked textile history graduate student was forced to look at it through a microscope and actually trace the pattern of the thread through the thing. Turns out there's this really bizarre technique. It's called naal binding, N-A-A-L binding, okay?
Before that, it's
And
N-I-A-L-L.
here, Karen, please. So here's the description of how null binding works. Make a loop. Put a needle on the end of your thread. Put it through the loop and pull the whole length of thread through until you've got a little loop. Now take the end of the needle on the end of the thread and put it in a loop and pull the whole length of thread through until you've got a little loop. And then take a loop and pull the whole length of thread through until you've got a little loop. Now, null binding fabrics are typically made with pieces of thread that are about 1 meter long. And then when they reach the end, they untwist the end of the next piece of thread and twist them back together, and then go on. Loop, 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 over and over and over again for, compared to knitting or crocheting, it's unbelievably slow, okay? The results look just like to the unexperienced eye until you take the time to trace every thread and where are they going. It looks like crochet or knitting, and that's why archaeologists and fabric historians thought until around the 1980s, they thought that crochet and knitting were ancient. Then they realized that they were wrong. So the question would be, why is it that we have no examples of something as simple, as something as clever as crochet or knitting in ancient times? Why aren't they there? Huh? Yeah. No, there's a better answer. Nobody thought of it. It's really that simple. Nobody thought of it. Someone had to think of it, and nobody did. There are lots of examples of that, and we're going to be talking about another one in just a moment. But nobody thought of it. And as silly as that sounds as the reason, it's nevertheless true that knitting was invented in the 80s, maybe 900 something, maybe, who knows. But the oldest example we have dates from after 1000. And crocheting was invented probably around 1800. Isn't that insane? Yeah.
None of this was useful for sail making or something?
Would it have been useful? Of course it would have. They made nets, but they didn't use those techniques. They wove sails using looms, but they didn't use those techniques. Yes, Karen?
I think the problem is that building nets is a man's job, and the yarn and the thread is a woman's job.
That's a nice theory, but the net result is no one thought of it, okay? Nobody did it, which is weird. Will you grant me that that's kind of weird? Okay, so I don't have PowerPoint slides. I don't have examples of knitting and crocheting because
but once someone has the idea, it's spread like wildfire.
Like wildfire, and Irish lace and all of those things, crocheting caught on like mad. But somebody had to think of it first, okay? So we're now going to talk about a tech example, okay? Now, y'all know about Gutenberg, right? And Gutenberg inventing the relatively modern movable type press, right? And he invented the whole technology of the sliding mold and the impressed letter form and casting type that was all rectangular and square, and they were different widths, and you could slide them together and make a page and ink it, put a piece of paper down on it, and make and print books and broadsides and all of that, right? And Gutenberg had all of that working long before 1632. There have been presses running for over 100 years all over, no big deal. Not only that, but prior to that, engraved plates were used all over the world. Woodcuts that you would ink and lay a paper on were used all over the world. Lots of printing technology, all relying on having a pattern that was raised or lowered on the page, and then laying a piece of paper on it and putting pressure on it and picking up the ink, right? And that existed. The Chinese, the Koreans had that wood block printing dates back to approximately the year 0, more or less. It's hard to tell for sure, but we have printed examples of stuff going way back. So that's okay. You'll grant me that it's kind of complicated, okay? And you have a pretty substantial investment in a press and in type and in wood blocks and carving the blocks or engravings or whatever. It's expensive. It's a lot of work. It's complicated. But in 1875, a guy that you've probably heard of, Thomas Alva Edison, invented something. It was a pen, a hollow tube, that had a needle running down it. And he put a little electric motor at the top, hooked it up to a set of batteries, and so the needle that was running down the tube would go pump, 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 pump. This is the great grandfather of every tattoo pen in the world, okay? But what Edison did with it was he took a sheet of wax paper, put it on a piece of blotting paper, and the pen went bump, 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 and poked holes as you wrote on the piece of wax paper. Then he could take a roller and run ink over his wax paper with holes in it and make copies. This is way simpler than printing presses. Would you grant me that? I mean, with his wax paper, you got a roller with ink, you got holes, you go, and you get copies. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. There was a problem.
Writing with the pen?
Yeah, writing with the pen.
Mimic what he.
Right. Exactly. So there was a problem with this. First, it was clunky. Electric motors were big, the whole pen was clunky, it didn't work terribly well, and you had to be someplace with batteries to power the electric motor. The only people who really sold it too much were the railroads, where they would use it, make a stencil, run off 10 or 12 copies, and post them around the train station or hand them to the engineers and stuff. But it was all handwritten, and that was how they made copies. Worked, okay? Then, that was in 1875. In 1875. Prior to that, nobody made copies of stuff using stencils. Ever. Anywhere. Yeah?
Is that similar to engraving?
No. Engraving means cutting channels in a metal plate. And then you run ink into those channels, wipe the ink off the smooth surface, put a piece of paper on and press really hard so the paper goes down in little channels, picks the ink up. That's completely different.
It's considerably older.
It's considerably older. This is just poking holes in a piece of wax paper. Okay? So that was 1875. In 1878, a guy in France came up with what he thought was a better idea. His better idea was he started selling a steel plate the size of the stencil that you want to make, and the surface of the steel plate was cut like the indentations in a file. So he sold this steel plate that was, the surface looked like a file, right? You know what file is.
Yeah,
so he sold those. They were pretty expensive because they were file cut steel plates that were several inches across. But the idea then was to set the wax paper on top of it. You took some sort of a stylus, you drug it over the surface, and the stylus would go through, the metal would poke up, you'd get holes in your wax paper, and you could put it on a frame and make copies. Still handwritten, but you could make copies. 1878. Then, in 1884, a guy living in England by the name of David de Stettner, some of you may have that name sound real familiar, came up with an idea that was mind-boggling. He took the stylus, right? And he mounted a little tiny wheel at the end of it, about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, very small. And around the edge of that wheel, at 120 teeth per inch, he put little pointy teeth. So now you could take the stylus that had the little wheel at the end and freehand just write or draw anything you wanted on your wax paper, and the little stylus would poke holes and you could make copies. He called this the cyclostyle wheel stylus. I don't own one. I will own one. I finally, after 11 years of having searches on eBay, I won an auction for one. I was not prepared to pay hundreds of dollars, okay? I wasn't. But I won one from a guy in England last week for $35. It didn't get here in time for this, but I'll have it next year. But it's really cool. It's just a stylus with a little tooth wheel, and you can freehand the holes in your stencil. Now, I want you to go back though to knitting and crocheting and how late those were invented. Will you grant me that there's nothing about what Edison and the French guy whose name will come up on the PowerPoint in just a minute that I can't remember, and Gestetner, nothing they did. You could have poked holes in wax paper and made a stencil with a needle and just gone poke, 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 if you wanted to. Is there anything that would have stopped the Egyptians from doing that, or the ancient Chinese? Anyone could have made stencils, wouldn't you think? But nobody did. Yeah.
The problem isn't the stencils, the problem is getting nice uniform wax paper.
Yeah, but there are
Well, I'll freely grant you that, but Edison and Gestetner's first stencils weren't waxed. They simply used a thin mulberry paper. They were only making a few dozen copies, and when they fell apart, you make another one. And so they didn't use wax paper. They used mulberry bark paper, and it worked fine. But the point is, anybody could have made stencils somehow. Will you grant me that? This is a simple technology, could have existed in ancient times. I've got another example for you, by the way. You know, Egyptians made these incredibly fine linens, right? Ancient Egyptians, thousands and thousands of years BC, Egyptians made super fine linens, 120 threads an inch. They're just astonishing. They're gorgeous. They wove sails. They had big sails on their craft, right? So and they were great woodworkers. They had all sorts of wonderful examples of woodworking. So and they had obviously thread because they wove the linen. So I have a question for you. Why didn't the Egyptians fly kites? Fly kites.
They never thought about it.
They never thought of it. The Chinese flew kites later, but the Egyptians never did. Is there anything in building a kite that would have prevented the Egyptians from making one?
No.
They didn't think of it. Okay, cultural, point to whatever cause you want. They didn't think of it, right? Okay, and lots of other cultures could have made kites early, but they didn't, right?
Well, Europeans didn't make kites until they saw Chinese.
Right, saw Chinese ones. But I want to give you a slightly different image, though, for the Egyptians, okay? And we'll talk about the pyramid building periods, okay? Because they had bamboo, they had this wonderful linen. So I want you to just picture in your mind for a moment people flying hang gliders off the pyramids in 3000 BC. Absolutely nothing that stopped them. Why didn't they do it? They didn't think of it. And so we have the exact same thing about stencils. Stencils were developed in the latter quarter of the 1800s. Yeah?
There's one other reason the Egyptians didn't do it, which is probably the same reason the Chinese didn't do it. In those days, being able to read and write was a profession.
Yeah?
It was reserved for typically the clergy,
Yep.
just as it was in Europe, the nobility,
Yep.
and a class of individuals called scribes,
Yep.
whose principal job was doing that,
Yep.
and whose greatest interest was in maintaining the most complex and hard to learn alphabet possible.
Absolutely, 100% agreed. But there's also in China a thriving technical class of smiths, casters, wood artisans. You can find in Chinese digs examples of trip hammers, water-driven, incredibly complex water-driven installations.
Innovation and literacy are not necessarily.
No, literacy doesn't have to do.
The southern pointing part.
Yeah, well,
It doesn't require you to be able to read.
certainly anybody who could build kites could have built a hang glider, but they didn't. Why? They didn't think of it and they didn't work on it for a long time. But they could have, yeah.
That name, Gestetner, has been rolling around my head. What else do you know about that? I think in the 50s and 60s, I used to use a Gestetner machine, but I can't think of what it was.
It's a mimeograph.
Duplicator.
A duplicator, a mimeograph. David Gestetner put out the first mass market mimeograph. Edison and the French guy had the same thing, but Gestetner with his cyclostyle made it effective and cheap, and he sold thousands of them. That was in 1884. By 1890, he had developed the automatic cyclostyle with the stencil mounted on a drum and with a crank that would go whoomp, whoomp, whoomp and make copies by the dozens or hundreds. Until the stencil wore out. And so then in 1894, Alan Baker Dick, A.B. Dick, sound familiar to some of you, in Chicago, came up with a porous paper which he put a wheat wax on, and you could make typed stencils.
It would cut through
It
the
would
paper.
cut through the wax, yeah.
Okay, what about the hectograph?
A different technology, which I'm happy to talk about. Let me finish this story.
Okay.
So Dick invented the typable stencil, the one that you could just draw on with any kind of stylus, press the wax out, get your copies. That was very cool. And then Dick in the US, in Chicago, and Gestetner in London cross-licensed. So Dick licensed the automatic cyclostyle, the crank Minio, and Gestetner licensed Dick's typable stencils, and the two of them made oh my, how the money flowed until the 70s. But
until the copy machine.
Until the copy machine. But God, the money flowed. Okay? But but it all starts in the latter quarter of the 19th century, which is kind of fascinating. So once again, I've had searches up on eBay for years and years and years and years and years. And so this year, we had a search come up. And here we have, I don't have the stylus, but here we have a neo-cyclostyle from 1884. Gestetner's first mimeograph.
That's such a cool name.
Okay, and so this is David Gestetner's first mimeo from 1884. And so over here, we have the parts. So there's a frame that you can clamp a piece of paper, a piece of wax paper, whatever you're going to use, in a frame. See that? So here we have a stencil that we've cut that is clamped in this frame, and then underneath of it there's a little metal plate, a little zinc plate. And so you put a piece of paper down like that, close the frame over it like that, and then you run an ink roller over this and squeeze ink through the holes, right? And you get a copy, which we're going to try here in just a moment. Although I brought the wrong tube of ink. I was supposed to bring the ink that's about the consistency of ink fabric, right? I got the tube of liquid ink. So we're going to try it anyway. It'll work, but we're not. Now, I'm not as hopeful as I would have been if I had the cake batter consistency ink. Is that fair? But I tried, okay? But how did we cut the stencil? I don't have Gestetner's cyclostyle stylus. I don't have one of the fancy file-shaped beds. I don't have a piece of Edison's tattoo pin. So how did I cut the stencil, which we cut here? Or how did she? Go ahead.
How patient were you?
Not that patient.
Not that patient.
Okay.
Not that patient. I will tell you how we cut these stencils, and you will go, oh yeah, that makes sense. I hope. Ready?
Sandpaper.
60 grit sandpaper. And a dully sharpened piece of wood. Put the wax paper, in this case it's plastic coated freezer paper, it doesn't really matter. Put your wax paper on the 60 grit sandpaper, and then take the stylus and press hard, and the sandpaper pokes through, and you get a stencil. This is the exact same as the French guy that sold his steel plates with the file teeth for lots and lots and lots of dollars, except this is cheap. Yeah.
Of course, the sandpaper didn't exist when he was making
Freely, but grant me this is cheap.
Oh, yeah.
And you could have taken coarsely ground sand and glue and made yourself something.
That's
Not that hard. So we're going to try. I cannot guarantee that this will work. I was originally, when I thought I had cake batter thicknessing, I was going to ask for a volunteer to come up here and make souvenirs for people. But I don't, and I'm not. So I'm going to pour a little ink out onto this inking platform. And I have plastic wrap all over the table, so don't worry. And I'm going to spread it out so I ink this roller nice. If I had the cake batter ink, I would get it out very smooth and have a thin layer on that platform. And then I would take the hard roller and get a coat of ink on the roller and squeeze it through the holes. Can't do that, have the wrong ink. I'm so sorry, I'm an idiot. So we're going to try it anyway with the felted roller, so we'll see what happens. Cross your fingers for me. So, felted roller, ink. Not working all that well. We'll try again. Ink. Yes, maybe. Okay, maybe. And so stencil, 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 stencil. We'll call that good. Maybe we have a picture. Lift it up, and yeah, it's liquid ink. Guess what happened? It blurred, okay? My bad. I grabbed the wrong tube of ink.
Well, you can read it.
But you see the principle? This is not high tech, right? And you can literally make that stencil with any sheet of paper and printer's ink that's of cake batter consistency, which of course, because printing presses are everywhere by this point, printer's ink is everywhere. And so it's not hard to come by. And at the period, the way that you would ink presses was you would have a board that you spread the printer's ink out on. Then you would have a stuffed leather bag with the handle sticking out that you would pound against the ink to get it coated. And then you would come up to type and go press, 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 and you get the ink spread. And the same exact pound with the leather bag would work perfectly for this. Yes?
Yeah, the other thing is that not only was the printer's ink everywhere, but in those days, most people, most printers made their own ink.
Many did. Although by 1630 in Europe, the production of ink was a trade.
Right, but the point is that it wasn't concentrated in one or two small manufacturers.
Oh, no, absolutely.
So if you needed a custom ink, like something cake batter ink, instead of the other stuff,
Right.
it would have been easy enough to find somebody to formulate.
Right, to put in less or more linseed. Yep, absolutely. So, you see how that works? Okay. Why is this weird tech then? There's nothing complicated about it. What makes it weird?
Nobody thought of it.
Nobody thought of it until the last quarter of the 19th century. That still boggles my little pointy head that nobody thought of it. And yet, this is the answer that keeps coming up over and over again as we talk about these things. By the way, that leads to the correct answer whenever anybody asks you the question, when will someone invent
What do you think?
whatever, right? Whether that's anti-gravity or a cure for the common cold or whatever, the correct answer is someone will invent it when someone thinks of it. And you can't predict when that will happen. Creativity is not controlled. So,
Creativity is related to Murphy.
well, okay, Murphy in reverse. All right, fine. I'll buy that. Okay. So that I think is at least interesting, and it's certainly weird. So we talked about the photograph. Don't you hate slide presentations? Don't you wish I could have brought one of those? That would have been so cool. I couldn't. So it was the Mimeo, Edison 1875. There's a picture of Edison's pen with the big motor on the top. Again, about the only people he sold it to were train companies, and they had them in the stations where they already had banks of batteries for the telegraph, and so they could run the little electric motor, and it was really a pain to use. Then Zucatos in 1877, the file plate to poke the holes in the stencil. And then Gestetner in 1884, the stylus with the little toothed wheel. Here are close-ups of 2 examples. And this is a close-up of the results of a stencil cut with the Gestetner's cyclostyle. And so you can see how the teeth left a little dot, 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 along the guessing stem. Okay? So, kind of cool. Presses. The one in the upper left is Edison's. The one in the upper right is Zucatos. And the one on the bottom is that one from Gestetner. My God, how many Gestetner in the 1960s in London employed 2,500 workers building mimeograph machines. Okay, and for those of you who were active in politics or were active in science fiction or who used mimeograph machines in colleges, high schools used dittos, right? The purple horrible things. Oh yeah. But colleges you more commonly would encounter mimeos, and so there was a quality thing. There were mimeo snobs, and everybody was of the opinion that the Gestetner machines were the top ranked ones, and the 80 Dick machines were somewhat below, but they were cheap and made in the U.S. You didn't have to import. So that was cool. So that I'm going to go change subjects, and we're going to talk about something else. But I wanted to offer you the opportunity, although you've been doing a great job of interrupting me, and that's fine, and I love it because I like to have a conversation. But anything about what we've talked about so far? Yeah.
One other thing, which is that the rexograph / hectograph type duplicating system could only get maybe 100 copies of the stencil, whereas with the mimeograph stencil, you can easily run out 2,500.
Absolutely, no question.
Because I remember using them back in high school.
Yep, absolutely. And it turns out we have done the experiment because some of us still own ancient Gestetner mimeos, and we've done an experiment, and with modern plastic coated freezer paper, the same stuff I used to make that stencil, you can easily get 1,500, 2,000 copies out of it. And so if you have an old electro stencil device which has a photocell and scans your source thing and has an electrically powered little needle that goes whenever it sees something black and feeds through, using freezer paper, you can get stencils that you mount that will easily do with over 1,000 copies. So that's fine.
The other thing that device was the ancestor of the fax machine.
Yes, Walter?
The mimeograph machine at Crankville High School?
Oh, sure.
No kidding.
So the only need is for supplies, not for the technology.
Right, oh, absolutely. But more importantly, the frame-based hinged mimeo, this style of mimeo, super cheap to build. It's wood, a couple of pieces of sheet metal, and 2 hinges. That's all you need. So these things, the committees of correspondence would have distributed all over Europe.
Well, you can make that with slate too instead of the iron plate.
No, you can make it with a smooth piece of wood. It just doesn't have to mention.
Not to mention broadsheets in Paris or in Magna.
Absolutely.
I mean,
So,
this is a golden age of
and if you want to make dozens of copies, and you don't want to mess with movable type, this is, or if you need a copy fast, this is your technique. Gordon.
And he was first.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jet.
It seems to me that there are 2 prerequisites for someone to have a reason to try to invent something like this. One is paper cheap enough to use for throwaway temporary use, and the other is a wide distribution of literacy in the population.
Which, of course, we had in the 1630s.
In Germany, and not in England.
Right. Well, England was an uncultured backwater. No, I mean, let's face it, England in the 1630s, right? Why? Well, a couple of reasons. The biggest one probably would be Henry's secularization of the monasteries, because the libraries of the monasteries after the secularization, the new barons and dukes that Henry created, many of them simply used the contents of those books as kindling like their fires. They would take the books literally into the outhouses. And huge numbers of books in England were destroyed, and since that same movement really reintroduced what amounts to serfdom, although they didn't call it that in England. Now, you had an incredibly low literacy, an incredibly low distribution of that sort of thing in England at the time. But in Germany, on the other hand, if you call literacy the ability to sign your name, to read and write printed material, to write printing, not cursive, fancy Spencerians, but still right. You had literacy rates approaching 90% in Germany at the time, right? So there were broadsheets. Virginia's been very careful to correct me that there were not daily newspapers. They weren't put out daily, but there were newspapers which had frequencies higher than once a week. And they were all over Europe, right? They went everywhere, except England, which was a cultural backwater and stupid and destitute. Gordon.
And back to your point about nobody thought of it. You will note in reading the 1632 series, many of the earlier books talk about the committees of correspondence and their printing presses and the complex printing presses. And why weren't they using mimeograph? Because they didn't think of it.
Right. And then, it's the same thing that we did about primers and gunpowder, okay? And we said, mercury fulminate primers are super sensitive, which they really are. They're really dangerous to make, which they really are. And those of us that were chemistry type people back in 2000 and 2001 and 2002, we all kind of got stuck on mercury fulminate primers, and we didn't come, and we knew that other primers were made with potassium chlorate, we knew that, but we just didn't put together the correct mechanism for making chlorate primers until a guy by the name of Robert Head showed up on the bar one day. He said, "Why aren't you making chlorate primers?" And we said, "Don't got." And he said, "Well, duh," and laid out, the process. And I, being the smart-ass know-it-all that I am, said, "Well, where are you getting the potassium from?" And his response of, "Well, when I did it on my patio, I dumped in a bunch of wood ash out of the fireplace." Caused a bunch of us to stand there and do head slap and then head bang and then, well, let's go for the wall because we can get a nice rhythm going. Several of us as a group sent Eric an email saying, "Okay, Eric, we're idiots and we'll offer to resign because we overlooked this." Eric's response was, "What do you mean resign? This is wonderful. If you guys didn't think of it, then my downtimers could have not thought of it, and we'll let the French think of it. They can advance on us," which was fun. And you should have heard the glee in his voice. It was so bizarre. And of course, that's why he is the boss and we're the flunkies, because he's
fine with
him.
chaos.
So
He's
anyway,
great with chaos.
so we have a lot of fun, but because they didn't think of it, applies to us as much as anybody, and it applies to our uptimers and our downtimers, just like everybody else, right? Okay, we're going to take a 5 to 10 minute break right now because it's 5 till and we need to take a break and I need more to drink and some of you may need to use the restroom, and we'll come back at 5 after and we'll start in on radio without electronics, okay? Which I promise will be fun and weird. Very weird.
Yeah, go buy books from Eric.
Go buy books from Eric.